they go right back to my earliest childhood. And not, I mean, they literally go back to my pre-literate days, just as the stories go back to almost a pre-literate time. Most of these stories were told by bards. Most of the heroes, including the courtly and kingly heroes of these stories, didn't read or write. That was a thing that lettered men and monks did.
Yep.
So there was an oral tradition. And I, in a sense, like a child born out of time, actually experienced that because my mother, my Scottish mother, was a commensurate storyteller and a great well of poetry and story. But she was also a historian and a scholar, and she knew Mallory back to front. So she was working with original sources. She didn't, foist on me these weird, expurgated, cleaned up versions of it.
Right. The more you talk about your mother, it seems like she's an extraordinary first contact person to have in this world.
Oh, she is, yeah. We wouldn't be talking, well, obviously we wouldn't be talking today without my mother, because my mother brought me into the world. But insofar as I'm a poet, I'm a poet because of my mother and my grandmother. Mm. My grandmother was a poet who wrote a cycle of poems specifically about St. Columba and St. Mungo and Kentigern was, and full of the pagan stories. She was a published poet in Glasgow. She imbued my mother with a complete love of poetry. My mother gave that to me. So my mother used to tell me stories about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, just sitting down and speaking to me. And I loved them and I played it. And I always liked Galahad, because I recognized that Lancelot was the kind of super fit captain and sporty, do you know what I mean? I knew I was never going to be that kid,
Yep.
But something about Galahad and his visions, and that I was attracted to Galahad. So those were important things to me. But she told me the stories. They were also the first mediation to me from an adult. I mean, an adult from whom I had complete love and security, but they were nevertheless within the context of that love and security. They were the first mediations to me of tragedy, catastrophe, mortality. I'll never forget. I mean, I couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. My mother told me the story of the dolorous blow. So that's the story which creates the wasteland, which create the wound, which of course, as you know, it's Balin, but it's about a knight who finds himself mysteriously in the castle of the Grail, but he doesn't know it's the castle of the Grail.
Love the story.
Because that's a mystery. But he gets into a quarrel with somebody who's been an invisible knight, and he slays somebody, and then the king, at this breach of hospitality, pursues him, and his sword breaks and he has no weapon, and he starts going through the castle, and of course he comes to this, you get this tremendous sense, and my mother described this to me so well, that he hears this faint chime and he comes into a holy room, and it's like, don't go in here, but he's on the run, he's feeling his life, so he goes in here, and then he sees this mystical procession, he sees the vessel, he sees the grail, he sees this spear, kind of shimmering, and from which drops of blood are coming, and meantime his assailant is coming in, who's in fact his host, the king. And, he breaks every taboo, and he seizes the spear, and he turns around and stabs the king who's pursuing him in the thigh. And then there's complete calamity and darkness, and the castle itself falls down. It was like the fall of Baron. And when he eventually kind of picks himself up out of the ruin, he comes to know that what he's done is taken the spear of Longinus, that this is the spear that wounded Christ. This is the most sacred thing. And he's used it actually to slay his host in the kind of utter desecration of hospitality. And not only has he brought ruin on himself and on but he has to, Merlin comes and finds him, and he goes out, and he recovers his own sword, and he rides out through a completely wasted land. This is where Eliot gets the wasteland and everything like that. Yep. And wherever he goes, my mother telling me people curse him because he's done this terrible thing. But, my little boy, I was saying, but he didn't know. But another bit of me is going like, he should have known. Yep. But the idea that you could do something yourself that brought utter calamity on everybody else, that was a new idea to me. And then, of course, it gets worse because he goes and fights an unknown knight who is his twin brother, and he doesn't know it. Yeah. And the two get to the point where they slay each other, and then they But, you know, my mother would let, and I was like, oh my God. But then, of course, my mother tells me, but the sword Merlin took from these two dead brothers who'd slain each other, and he set it in a red marble stone, and he caused it to float on a thing because he knew that the healing would come and the Grail night would come. And then, of course, Galahad comes to the court, you know, and he will be the one who will eventually take that same spear and go back to that castle, which has been partly rebuilt, and ride through the wasteland. And with the drops of blood from the spear, will heal the wounded king, the fair king, the healing of the king. So what my mother didn't tell me, which is a thing I'm exploring now, that Galahad himself, I mean, Galahad is begotten, if you like, illicitly, when Lancelot strays to the same castle, and the king's daughter, Pepeles, the king's daughter, Elaine, is enchanted so that Lancelot thinks she's Guinevere. And the moment when Lancelot finally commits the sin of adultery, as he thinks he's sleeping, he's not sleeping with Guinevere, you know, he's real. But what he does, that's when Galahad is begotten. Now, Tennyson doesn't give us any of that. That's all just completely cleaned up.
Wow.
But actually, for me, that idea that just in the point of misery and with the very instruments of the misery, or just at a point of straying, an amazing grace can be loosed in the world.
Yep.
The whole thing can, you know, that's eucatastrophe. Now, I just find that so resonant as a story and so necessary to tell again.
That's great. Yeah. I mean, I remember just recently going through a couple of years ago when I was trying to get through this, again, Middle English from Caxton. You can get there, but if you're untrained, it takes a little bit of time. And it's one of those things where, you know, the same word can be spelled 3 different ways on the same page. And it's,
it's great.
It's so great. It's so great once you get into the rhythm of it. But then I remember the point of getting to that where he gets the spear and uses it. And then it says that it was the spear that was used to pierce the side of Christ. And I just stopped. I was like, did I read that right? And I was looking back and did I get that? And I thought, man, that is a story and a half. Like anyone who's willing to.
That's a classic story. That's what they did was this cycle of stories is woven into the cycle of the Christian stories. So why is that spear even there?
Right.
Why is well, we've got this fantastic backstory about Joseph of Arimathea.
Right.
Who is the real character in John's gospel, who's the guy who gives up his own grave so that Jesus can lie in it. And it's like, he kind of fades out of the gospel story. And you're like, what happened to him? Well, the answer, according to the Arthurian legends, is that he was imprisoned by the Sanhedrin after the persecution of Christians. He was meant to be starved to death in a tower. Jesus appeared to him and gave him the chalice. And he was fed from that. And then when the full persecution comes after the siege of Jerusalem, Joseph was a trader. He was a Phoenician trader. And we do know that, in fact, the Phoenicians traded with Cornwall, with the tin mines in Cornwall. So the story was that he sailed with the chalice and the spear and the other relics and came to Britain.
Yeah.
And that he founds a church there. And that he walks to Glastonbury, and that when he plants his staff in the earth there, the sign that that's where he should be, the staff flowers into a flowering thorn, which is still there. You know, it's still there, and it's still and the tradition of the Glastonbury thorn is that when I say it's still there, it flowers on Christmas Eve. It flowers at the time of the incarnation. But anyway, interestingly, this goes so deeply into the British psyche that when we had our Puritan revolution and we were trying to get rid of all these, and the Puritans hated these stories and hated everything about it and hated the idea of sacred kingship. I'll tell you this extraordinary thing. On the day they beheaded Charles I, at the same time, they had somebody go out to Glastonbury and hack down the thorn.
Wow.
You know, they understood that link. They repudiated it.
Wow.
But they're saying, we're getting rid of kings and we're getting rid of this stuff as well. But of course, what happened was that everybody in Glastonbury came and took cuttings of it.
Yep.
And planted it everywhere. And there are still thorns. I literally, 10 years ago, I was invited to a ceremony in a Cambridge college of the balming of the thorn, because this college very proudly had a scion of the Glastonbury thorn that had been brought by royalists from that and planted in this college garden.
Really?
They literally tied ribbons on it and danced around it. And they wanted me to come and sing my song, The Green Man, there, you know. Like, this stuff is not dead, you know.
Oh my God. And
there's an earlier legend that, in fact, not only did he bring the chalice, but that earlier, because one version of the story is that Joseph of Arimathea is sort of Jesus' uncle. Because there's a big blank in the story of Jesus from when he's 12 in the temple to when he appears, the idea is that he took the infant Jesus to England on one of these journeys. So
Right.
William Blake's famous thing, which is effectively our national anthem, apart from God Save the Queen, and did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green, and was the holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen, and did the countenance divine shine forth upon our clouded hills, and was Jerusalem builded here among those dark satanic mills. We sing that.
Yeah.
Everybody knows that in England. And it's the Glastonbury legend. So it's kind of quite deeply rooted in who we are. And I think all for the good. Though, as I say, every so often we get these anti-legendary kind of Puritan reactions and they try and hack it down, but nobody can hack it down.